All right, everyone. Keith, thank you for joining us. I'm really excited about it. I'm a little bit familiar with some of the stuff you've released before, and you privied me to the full album, which is, what is it? The Full Moon at the Comet Hotel is the name of the record, right? Okay.
Full Moon at the Comet Hotel, that's correct.
Right. So what was the inspiration behind the title of the record?
Oh, okay. We used to be called Comet Hotel about 15 years ago.
Ah,
It's the same three people. We've worked together for about 30 years.
so it's a throwback, a little bit of a throwback.
Kind of. Yeah, kind of.
All right.
Through various name changes
Right.
and kind of used different lineups every now and then, but it's the same core three people.
Right.
And about 15 years ago, we were called Comet Hotel.
I like that name too, honestly. That's a really good name.
It's all right, isn't it? Yeah. I got it off of a film.
It's very Wes Anderson feeling, the Common Hotel.
Well, it was done by a guy called Zach Galligan called Nothing Lasts Forever.
Yeah.
Oh, Nothing Lasts Forever is one of my favorite movies. And just very briefly, there's a scene where there's this building in New York called Comet Hotel.
Ah, you pulled it from that one. Very cool. Well, you actually answered another one of my questions in your answer there, because I'm just learning about you guys now, and I wasn't sure if it was like more of a solo project where you were doing most of the stuff, or if it was, a small group of people that were doing, like a band that has been doing this stuff together. So you kind of answered my question there. I didn't know if it was you and you collaborated with different people, because it's a very eclectic type of, record. It's got a lot going on in terms of influences pulled from all over the place. You know what I mean? There's electronic and kind of synth wavy kind of influences. There's plenty of classic rock influences. It's just a good mixture of natural and digital instrumentation. And I think that mixture together creates like a really cool atmosphere for the record. But when you listen through the whole record from top to bottom, here's a question for you. Is this a concept record?
Oh, is it a concept record? It might be. I have no idea what the concept is, but it kind of ends like a concept record, I think.
Yeah.
I think the song kind of winds it all down and really finishes it.
Right. Yeah. It was very kind of out there. And I think that the experimental aspect of it was really strong. And I liked how, not in a negative way, but in a positive way, it could feel scattered in a way, but still really pulled together, because certain songs on the record felt slightly haunting. You know what I mean? Like there's very cinematic, and it was very kind of haunting at certain times. And then other times it was colorful and, synth pop, feeling, it just kind of was all over the place. But the reason I bring up the concept thing is because there was this glue that kind of holds it all together. So it all makes perfect sense, throughout the record. So what I wanted to ask you, really, I guess not first, but where'd the record come from? What was the inspiration for the record? Did you guys have did something in particular inspire this album? Like where was it born from for you?
It started with the pandemic. I wrote one of the songs in the pandemic when I was kind of just walking on my own, and got this melody come into my head, and that started it off. And then some of the songs are from way back, like one of them is from 1997, when we made an album with a British guitarist called Mick Hutchinson.
Wow.
And we did a song called Overland, which was based on a Russian scale. So I started with that and I revised that. I kind of re-recorded that, took just chord sequence.
Yeah.
All the rest of it I threw away because I hadn't got the stems anyway. So I started. And then a friend of mine who's a visual artist in Frankfurt asked me to write a song for his computer game.
Wow.
Which was based on the life of a woman called Rosemary Nitribit, who was a high-class hooker. And she got murdered by one of her clients, and she became she became famous in Germany.
Wow.
So he based his computer game, the central character, on this woman, Rosemary, and called her Rosalie.
I was going to say, is that the Rosalie song I was going to ask? Yeah.
And then during lockdown, a friend of mine who lives in North Hollywood and writes for a TV show saw David Lynch in his house. And he has this zigzag gallery that goes up the front of his house, this glass gallery. And my friend Garth could see David Lynch shuffling up the gallery.
That's awesome.
And I thought that was such a lovely image. So we used that. And it went from there. And I don't really know if there is a kind of a journey through. I don't know what it's based on after that.
I mean, that's a good as answer as any, just because it's, you gave me it tells me that the record itself is pulled from all these different places. I mean, for a lot of people, the pandemic, obviously the lockdown and all this, it gave people a lot of extra time, if you will. And a lot of amazing music spawned from that. And I've spoken with other bands and other artists who found like a rebirth musically because of it. They've been musicians for writing records for a long time, and then they kind of broke off and met adulthood and got married and had kids and all this and that. And then the pandemic gave them all this, all of a sudden they had all this free time, and they were looking around, and they started doing, back. So I know how the pandemic sparks, gives you the window, give a lot of people the window, so to speak, to create new stuff. But this record is massive, though. I mean, how long did it take for you guys to complete the record?
3 years.
3 years.
When you ask me if it's a solo project, it kind of is, really.
Okay.
In a way. And I was drawing from ideas that we've had over the years and kind of bringing those into the present moment and stitching together this, whatever it is.
Right.
So there's a lot of ideas coming from different places. So if it makes sense as a whole, that's great, because I wasn't sure if it did.
It does. It's you have to listen to, for everything to come together. This is one of the albums you have to listen to from beginning to end. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I'm from a certain, I'm of a certain age. When I was, I see you have, it looks like that's vinyl in the background. There are a lot of vinyl records. Mm-hmm. And I also collect a bit of vinyl myself. And, back when we were kids, you'd hear a song from somewhere, you'd go see a band play, or you'd hear a song on the radio, or you'd read about a band in a magazine, and then you'd go to the store to get the record, whether it was a cassette or, or a vinyl record or a CD or what have you. And you would go for the one song and get the record, and it would be part of an album unless they released, like a little 45 or something. And you get this whole experience, you know what I mean? Like I see the vinyl in the background, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's, people like me grew up looking at the liner notes and like listening to the record and just doing nothing else. You didn't do anything else when you listened to records. You just zoned out and soaked it in. Nowadays, it's different for, certain kinds of generations. I feel like people that aren't musicians themselves, when they listen to music, it's kind of in the background while they're doing other stuff. But when we were growing up, we sat on the couch. For me personally, I would smoke a little weed, and when I was a kid, and zone out on, Floyd and, all kinds of stuff. But, this is one of those albums where I wish I had a vinyl copy of it. Are you guys doing any vinyls of it?
We did a micro run of 5 live cuts.
Ah, sick. So cool. So cool.
It's really so that we can have one each.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's brilliant. I mean, this is a record I would be sitting around listening to on vinyl, because there's a lot of layers going on. So for you, so I was kind of right. It is, to an extent, a little bit of a solo album, but you brought the guys in but you kind of stitched things together and brought it to fruition from older ideas and from riffs that you had in your head and melodies and things like that. So how did it start for you personally, Keith? When did you fall in love with music? Like, did your mom listen to records when you were a kid? Like, how did that work?
This is going back a long way. I'm 71 years old. So we're going back to a time when you had a thing called a gramophone.
Yeah, of course.
Where you had a needle that had to be replaced every time you played a record. And this thing was cranked with a handle.
Yep.
And it soon became clear to my mum that if she sat me in front of this thing, she could go off and do whatever it was, go to the shops, do the washing, sweep the floor, whatever.
Right.
I'd be transfixed. from the age of 18 months. And apparently, before I could read, I learned to tell what record it was by the pattern of the grooves, by the light and shade in the grooves, and probably the colour of the label and all this sort of thing.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I had my dad's record collection, which was a bit of classic musicals, like The King and I, South Pacific, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that was how I started.
That's where it was born from. And then what, did you play guitar first or keys or what?
No, I didn't play anything until I was, hold on a minute, no, 25.
Okay.
And I had a second-hand record shop in my hometown.
Mm-hmm.
And one afternoon, this young man comes in with an armful of singles, and he was in a British punk band called Alternative TV with a guy called Mark Perry.
Okay.
Who's something of a bit of a hero still in this country in terms of left-wing working class music.
Right.
And this guy said that he was taking over the band, which by then was called the Good Missionaries, from this guy, Mark Perry. And he was looking for people to join the band, and he wanted me to play bass. And I said, "That's great, David, but I don't play." And he said, "That's perfect. That's what I want." No musical experience. So we start from the ground up.
Wow.
This was in August of 1979, and by Christmas we were making an album in London. So I had to learn to play the bass in 4 months. Well, I had to learn to play the bass for those particular songs. It was a bit like Captain Beefheart, where he just said, "Play that. Do it exactly the way I show you."
Right.
And so I didn't really learn to play the bass. I just learned to play his songs on the bass.
Right. But that in turn taught you how to play the bass.
Well, to some extent.
Yeah,
I picked up a lot of bad habits, and I've never got rid of them. So now I just I use a lot of synthesizers, and I just kind of mess about until I find something I think sounds okay, and then I use it.
Yeah, I mean, the album has, like I said, it's got a great crossover of natural and digital instrumentation, and I was surprised at that balance, because there is a great balance of there's guitars and obviously bass, but there's also a lot of keys and a lot of synths throughout the record too, and a lot of times the synth tones and the textures that you use on the record, there's something about this album that feels semi-vintage in a way. It's got an old school feel to it, and that was obviously just of course it was natural, but it was like an aesthetic you were going for, and that breaks down to your classic influences, obviously, as a musician, as a kid, and what about do you do live performances or anything? I mean, I don't know how you would, but just out of curiosity, do you do any live stuff?
We did some gigs in 2019, right before the pandemic.
Right.
We did a year's worth of gigs, and then lockdown came.
And that was done.
Then, like a year later, we started up again with a few different people because some people had gone on to other things.
Yeah.
And we did another year's worth of gigs, and then all of a sudden, pretty much overnight, the whole thing fell apart. So this was a recording project. There won't be any more gigs. It's now just a recording project.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like for someone like yourself, so you have a home studio then, yeah?
Yeah, I'd make it in my living room. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I think that's kind of the brilliance of it, is I think that your home and your natural creative zone is probably in your home studio. I obviously, like you said, when you were 25, you had an opportunity, you took it, you played a lot of, probably loads of gigs throughout your life, but listening to this record kind of, to me, just says that, you're in your zone and you can create with here's the thing about this record. There's a lot of different, it's like a genre bending album, there's no way possible I could say this is this genre. I just can't. It's not one thing, but I like that. And what's funny about it is that your guy's been around a long time. You've been making music for a long time, and the concept of creating music, that kind of morphs genres and blends them together at free will is a concept that a lot of younger artists and bands are starting to do now. They're starting to realize that they don't have to create something that conforms to, whatever whatever's on the radio, whatever most people are listening to. I think more artists now are more like you, where they're starting to pick up on the fact that you can create something that doesn't have walls, built around it. And I think that people would appreciate this album too, because of that factor, because this is a record that it's got fewer boundaries than the norm, than people may be used to. But I like that, because throughout the record, you have these kind of outside the box sections all over the place, but there's also tracks that are just pop songs basically, and so like, and even the pop songs have some experimental attributes to them for sure, but there's still pop songs. So you're not shying away from being like, hey, I know how to write a pop song, I'm going to throw some pop songs in there. You're not afraid to do that, but you still do it in your own fashion, where it's very, it's experimental and it's fun. Oh, you know what? So it's 3 people. So I wanted to know, what for you yourself, what are you performing on the record? You're doing keys and guitar and bass?
I do all the bass.
Right.
I do some of the keys. I do all the synthesizer parts.
Okay.
My partner, Amanda, who is in her own band called The Big Believe, she plays the keyboard parts I can't play, because she's a classically trained pianist.
Right.
When there are bits that need that dynamic, that skill, to be able to just play C sharp major, boy, there it is. If I want that, I have to go look on the internet, see what the notes are, and play them pretty much separately,
right,
and stitch it all together that way. So, and I play bits of guitar, but not a lot, really, Gabriel, to be honest. I play on the Rodway song, just some bits. And then I get my horn player is an Argentinian person living in Basel in Switzerland. So he sends his notes via email. I get him from air gigs.
So it's kind of all over the place. So some of you are not in the same place.
Yeah, no, we're not all in the same place. No.
Wow.
And our singer who isn't on this album is a Norwegian person who she played Princess Leia in Star Wars Rogue One, and she also sings. She's a folk singer, and I would send her the song, she'd record her part and send it back to me, and we meet about 2 or 3 times a year, but most of the time she's in Holland. So this is really coming from all over the place.
Wow, that's so cool. I really love the idea of a project where people are coming from different places and sending tracks back and forth, because to me, when I listen to an album like this one, and even just the fact that you write a lot of it yourself and you put it together. Did you mix the record yourself? No. Oh, you didn't?
No. My engineer is called Fritz Catlin, and he was in a British post-punk band called 23 Skidoo.
Oh, I've heard of that band before.
And he also played with Leibach, the German kind of doom electronica band.
Nice.
If you know Leibach. Leibach did a version of Let It Be, which is absolutely brilliant. And Fritz's mother or father, I think, no, his mother worked for the BBC and was a contemporary of Delia Derbyshire.
Wow.
So he has history going way back, and he is a fantastic engineer, and he's basically hip hop and dub. That's his world. So he brings that little worldliness to it that I really like. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, there's, this is definitely a big record to soak in. There's, to me, to me, it felt very cinematic at times. There's kind of rises in intensity, at different points in the record. Very orchestrated at times, you know what I mean? Especially some of the earlier tracks on the record. The first one, Natasha Says, I think, is the first track. Is that right? So that song introduced the record, and it did a really good job of introducing the record. But no matter what you do, I mean, this is my favorite thing about this album. This is my favorite thing about it, is that you can listen to 3-4 songs off the record, and you may get a gist, you know what I mean? But you unless you listen to the whole thing, you're not getting the whole spectrum of what it has to offer. And that's the cool thing about the record. It's like an album. That's what I meant by calling back to the old school days where you go and get a record and you heard a song on the radio. You were like, oh, this song's great. You go to the store, right? You go and buy the record and you sit down. And what did you do? You listen to the single was on an album. You listen to the whole album, nothing else but the whole. And that became an experience. And this record brought me back to that kind of vibe and that kind of aesthetic, because I listened to it with headphones on, which is this is a record. This is the best way to do it, because there's notes and things floating around the ether of, you know, the tracks. If you listen with headphones, is the best way to listen to this record, in my opinion, because then you could soak in all the, you know, the things that are going on. It was mixed super well, because to me, when you have a record that's kind of a crossover and a genre bender and has the natural and the digital instrumentation, all that stuff put together, I feel like that's a tough thing to mix, you know? And he did an amazing job mixing it, because everything is very, very balanced out. Nothing is over the top, you know what I mean? Everything is just very balanced to where it should be. And all of the kind of intense and almost emotional kind of sections of the record come through the way they are supposed to. You can kind of feel the intensity of them. And that's where I get the word cinematic. I keep repeating the word cinematic in this, because it's to me, this is a lot of times a very cinematic record, but that's because of partially because it's mixed. And I don't, in reviews and interviews and stuff, usually we don't touch on the mix of a record, but a lot of people that aren't musicians themselves don't understand the skill, the skill and the mindset that you have to mix a record. And this is not the kind of record. This is not a punk rock record, man. You know, this is not like, all right, we got one guitar player, one bass player, one drummer, one singer, and we're gonna, there's 4 chords total in this song, and we got to turn this dude's mic down a little bit for the recording because he's blasting. It's much more complicated than that when you have such a record that's got so much lush instrumentation and so much vastness in its undertone, and it's got to come through with a certain aesthetic. And I really feel like you nailed it. And I'm not just kissing butt, if you will. It really came out awesome. And I think that the piano and the keys were the strongest. In my opinion, one of the strongest elements of this record. The synths, the keys, and the piano were super imperative. They were and some guitar work, of course, too. But the synths, the keys, and the pianos were like the meat instruments of the record, and all of the way it all came together was really an excellent and just kind of forward-moving flow. It was eclectic and it was experimental and it was like avant-garde and outside the box, and but again, you still kept those pop elements in there where you wanted to. So I really feel like it came out good. And then I wanted to, end off with just talking about what is it? Aldora Britain Records is the label. Is that your label, or is that a label that put you out? What's your relationship there?
It's a label that's run in England, from a town called Rodway, which is somewhere in the north of England. I don't know exactly where it is. But the owner of the label approached my partner, Amanda, because he'd heard her on Bandcamp and said, hey, I really like what you do. Can I put out some of your stuff? And she said, yes, and he did. And so I got in touch. I wasn't going to be outdone. I got in touch and I said, hey, what do you reckon? Can you cope with some of this? So he put that out, and we've been doing that ever since.
So I appreciate you taking the time, Keith. And again, The Full Moon at the Common Hotel should be out by now, by the time this one airs. It's by Necessary Animals. And thank you for taking the time. I appreciate you, man.
Thank you for doing this, Gabriel. I'm really grateful that you wanted to do it. Seriously. And I can tell that you've actually listened to the record, and I'm really grateful. Seriously.
Yeah, like I listened to it like 3 times, man.
Consequently, I can tell you that this will come to no good end. All these ghosts inside my head the alphabet from A to Z. The heartache and the strife, they get harder life by life. And every night that I live, it's between just me and you. No one has a master plan. We all struggle to get through, and we all doing what we can, and nobody knows who I am. All the lives I could have had, all the lives that turned out bad, the stories I've been told, I've been bought and sold, and then nobody gives a damn. And this is the price that I pay, and I'm paying day by day. And sometimes I can see the person that I used to be.